bourgeoisie produces, above all, art zone. Grave diggers.
Hey everyone.
Hi, how are you all?
Another fresh week and a fresh episode of Das Criminal.
I am Erin from Seoul,
And Amr in Toronto.
and we are very excited to be here with you. You've probably noticed that we have moved our release date to Tuesday mornings instead of Monday mornings. That just fits our schedules a bit better. We live 13 time zones apart, so it takes some coordination.
Yeah, the window for recording episodes is rather narrow. And of course, there's always post-production, which we thank Erin for. She's the one behind the ones and twos.
And we both have full-time jobs, and we both have just a lot going on right now. So we really appreciate you sticking with us while we just kind of work some of these things out.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
We do have good news on the Amr front.
What news is that?
Oh, Amr's Radio War Nerd Part 2 is out.
Oh, right, yeah.
Yeah, I got a notification on my phone yesterday. I squealed with delight.
It's long. I think it's like 2.5 hours. I think we're gonna make it 4-episode series. It was supposed to be 3 initially, but this second episode went longer than expected without covering as much material as I thought it would, in terms of like timelines. So there might be a 3rd episode. Hopefully we'll record it as soon as possible and release it, and then a 4th episode after that.
To our Patreon subscribers, your $10 and up monthly bonus episode should be up right about now. I'm finishing the editing, so it'll be up shortly before this episode comes out. We do want to give a content warning for this one. So we will be talking about sex crimes and violence against sex workers. If this is something that really upsets you, this is not the best episode for you. If you've been listening to our podcast for a while now, you'll likely have noticed that Amr and I fall pretty firmly on the side of prison abolition. In our episode on Amy Beale, we discussed reconciliation over punitive measures. Earlier, during our analysis of the murder of Mulugeta Sarah, we covered how prisons can be spaces that radicalize white supremacists. Our episode on some seriously shady behavior in the world of forensic science covers several cases where innocent people were sent to prison on faulty or fabricated evidence. In our episode on the criminalization of HIV transmission, we note how incarceration is rarely in the interest of public health and safety. While perhaps a unique position among true crime podcasts, a reimagining of the carceral system is an established demand of most leftists worldwide. As Professor Angela Y. Davis has noted, prisons are obsolete. Rather than prevent harm, they function to punish people for crimes of poverty and maintain a steady stream of ultra-exploited workers. The prison system, we argue, does more harm to society than good. The root cause of most crimes, poverty brought on by exploitation and inequality under capitalism, is not solved by incarceration. If we want to live in a truly safer society, we need to address the problems of capitalism, institutionalized discrimination, normalization of violence against vulnerable communities, and inaccessibility and stigma associated with mental health care. Okay, we can hear our listeners thinking, that's all well and good. And here comes the big question. What about the rapists? What about the serial killers? I will be the first to admit I still haven't found a complete and comprehensive answer to this question, and it is an important question. According to estimates by the World Health Organization, quote, 1 in 3, or 35% of women worldwide, have experienced either physical and or sexual intimate partner violence or non-partner sexual violence in their lifetime, end quote. Women from particularly vulnerable communities, such as poor women, trans women, sex workers, and incarcerated women, are especially at risk. Thus, while it's true that most rapists are never incarcerated, and most incarcerated people are not rapists, I don't think we can dismiss concerns about sex crimes as red herrings in discussions about prison abolition. I've seen some theorists, many of whom I greatly respect, argue that stranger rapists and serial killers are relatively rare.
Yeah, I find that a very disturbing argument. I mean, it's also statistically unlikely for me to die in a plane crash, but I still wear my seatbelt during flights. Also, keep in mind, unlikely is not non-existent. Even the existence of one serial killer or stranger rapist is something that needs to be reckoned with by the abolition movement, and I have seen very few attempts to do such reckoning.
Also, just because most rapes are committed by someone the victim or survivor knows doesn't make it okay.
Yeah, we still have to deal with those rapists. Like, even if you're like a rapist is like, I don't know, like a spouse or whatever, like there still needs to be some sort of like way of applying justice. And I'm not saying carceral punishment is right. I'm just saying sometimes, a healing circle or whatever is not the best outcome for these scenarios.
There was a popular prison abolition arguments chart going around that made a lot of very good points, but one thing that did rub me the wrong way was regarding the question, what about the rapists? The first line of this arguments chart was, most rapists are someone the victim knows. Which is true, but what is your point?
Yeah, that's not answering the question. That's just observing a fact. Like, okay, and then what do you do with them?
Right, and I think what they are alluding to is that we need more intra-communal forms of justice, which is fine, but then they need to explain that more than just saying, oh, well, stranger rapists are rare. Like, okay, and what's your point? I'm still afraid to go out alone at night because of that possibility. It's not that rare.
Yeah, and even like in terms of like, well, most rapes are done by someone you know. What if that person like is a repeat offender, right? Like they have a history of abusing their siblings, their spouses, people close to them, etc., etc. What's the solution to that? Like clearly, rehabilitative justice might not work if they keep repeating. So what's the outcome? What's the best way of applying sort of justice to that?
We are definitely going to discuss this throughout the episode. That's why we've chosen this case, is to get more into that. So I think the relative rarity of serial killers and sexually motivated murderers doesn't mean that most women, and especially women who are more likely to be exposed to this type of violence, like sex workers, most of us worry that we are going to become victims of these crimes. I know that I am statistically unlikely to be murdered by a serial killer, but I still don't go out alone at night. And given past experiences that I've had, I don't think this is unreasonable for me whatsoever. To have a more nuanced conversation about sex crimes, prison, and rehabilitation, we're going to dissect a case that touches on all these themes, that of Austrian serial murderer Johann Jack Unterweger. In many ways, Jack Unterweger was a textbook serial killer. He hated women, possibly as a result of mommy issues.
Yeah, and I mean, that's a classic serial killer red flag from my understanding. Ed Kemper killed his own mother. Granted, she was abusing him, but that led to hatred of women in general. Richard Speck and Monty Russell also hated women. The former Speck resented his mother for marrying an abusive stepfather after his father died. And Russell started killing after seeing his ex-girlfriend with another man. And Russell's first victim was a sex worker as well.
Born in 1951 in Graz, the second largest city in Austria after Vienna, Jack Unterweger had an Austrian mother. Some sources claim that she was a waitress or a barmaid, while other sources say she was a sex worker. I mean, at least in my mind, she could very easily be both.
Yeah, definitely.
Unterweger's father was allegedly a U.S. soldier who was stationed in Austria following World War II, but his father was never in the picture.
Yeah, that's another aspect of US imperialism that I think is less talked about. The sort of US troops stationed abroad having children with locals and then sort of like bailing.
Yeah, it is really, really sad. And Jack continued to have a sad childhood after his mother allegedly abandoned him to his grandfather when he was 2 years old. This was possibly because she was arrested and had to go to prison or deal with some legal issues.
Yeah, I think going back to the above, it does seem that it's a recurring pattern among serial killers that they feel a sort of resentment and loathing of women stemming from some sort of abandonment issues. I mean, Richard Speck, I was reading the psychological assessment of him done during his trial, and the psychiatrist seemed to think Speck had a Madonna whore complex in which he idolized women until he perceived that they betrayed him, not necessarily accurately betrayed him, but he thought they betrayed him. And then he'd, be violent towards them. And that stemmed from his mother marrying his abusive stepfather.
Yeah, as we will go into as well, Unterweger targets sex workers. And I think there are multiple reasons for this. The first one, I think, is very practical in that it is easy to get a sex worker to go to a spot alone with you in certain circumstances. Like, it's easy to lure that person away from a group or a crowded place. But I also think it has to do with the Madonna whore complex, like you said, and how Jack Unterweger sees women, and particularly sex workers, as people who are not even human.
Yeah.
Jack's grandfather was an alcoholic, and Jack also develops a dependency on alcohol at a very young age. Now, whether Jack's grandfather was physically or sexually abusive is not clear, but it's safe to assume that he was not a kind and loving parental figure. Allegedly, Jack's aunt, his mother's sister, Anna, was also a sex worker who was murdered by someone who hired her. So perhaps this is also kind of formative to Jack's pathology. From when he was 15 to 23 years old, Jack Unterweger was convicted of 16 different offenses and spent most of his time in and out of prison. The charges included theft, pimping, and sexual assault. Unterweger also likely attacked sex workers during this time. Later he wrote, and please excuse the terminology, I do not like these words, but these are the words he uses, quote, "I wielded my steel rod among the prostitutes of Hamburg, Munich, and Marseille. I had enemies and conquered them through my inner hatred," end quote.
Yeah, there's a lot of pathology going on there.
In December of 1974, Jack Unterweger abducts and murders 18-year-old Margaret Schaefer by strangling her with her own bra. Some sources report that Margaret was a sex worker, and others do not. We see this throughout the case, debates as to whether the victim was a sex worker or not. And on one hand, someone's profession shouldn't matter to how much we mourn someone as a victim of a horrific crime. Law enforcement and the media often create this dichotomy of innocent victims versus people who had it coming, and that is dehumanizing. It is victim blaming, and it removes some degree of responsibility from the perpetrators. On the other hand, sex workers, houseless people, and people with addictions are too often deemed as less important, and law enforcement spends little time and effort investigating violence against them. Sometimes these cases are even called by law enforcement "no humans involved." From David Correa and Tyler Wall's Police, a Field Guide, which I'm sure we've sourced before on this podcast, quote, "No humans involved in the police lexicon" refers also to the murder of women they consider prostitutes, whose slayings they describe as misdemeanor murders, a reference to the total lack of concern regarding their deaths throughout the criminal justice system, end quote. We can't just pretend that violence against sex workers doesn't happen, especially as sex workers themselves are criminalized despite being the victims of violence. According to HG.org, Sex work is the most dangerous profession in the United States, with a higher death rate than Alaskan fishermen, loggers, or oil rig workers. The death rate of sex workers in the United States is 204 per 100,000 people. For comparison, the death rate of police officers is 13.7 per 100,000 people. That statistic stunned me. 204 per 100,000 people is so high.
Yeah, that's insane. Also, I don't think cops are even in the top 10 of dangerous professions. Like 13.7 is so low.
I think the average is somewhere around 3.5, but that includes literally everyone. Like it includes accountants.
Yeah, you never trust your stapler, eh?
So, for the murder of Margaret Schaefer, Jack Unterweger was convicted in 1976 and sentenced to life in prison. Now, a life sentence in Austria carries a minimum term of 15 years. So this means that you can stay in prison for life, but after 15 years, you are eligible for parole. As an aside, I also have a moral issue with this type of indefinite detention, especially for crimes of poverty, as we've previously discussed. You and your family should know a definite date that your incarceration will end.
Yeah, I also think parole is very disturbing to me as a concept, insofar as your release depends on the sort of whims and the internal biases and feelings of a panel of people who may be extremely punitive or not, and it seems entirely subjective whether a prisoner is granted parole.
Also, I think it's despicable that in the United States, after you have served your sentence, you are still marked as a felon for lots of crimes like robbery and can't live a normal life, can't vote, can't get a job. That's ridiculous.
Yeah, even from a punitive perspective, if we admit that someone served their punishment, did their punishment, then surely they deserve the right to live after that. But the system seems designed to punish you for the rest of your life.
Exactly. And then you tell people they need to reintegrate into society while making that impossible.
Yeah, and then they do crime again because they can't do anything else, and it becomes a revolving door.
Yeah, it's despicable to me. While inside prison, Jack Unterweger became a model prisoner. Unterweger, who was allegedly previously illiterate, learned to read and write, and began writing about his life and experiences. His autobiography, and this is the whole title, Purgatory or the Trip to Prison, Report of a Guilty Man, became a bestseller in Austria. I tried to search for excerpts from Unterweger's writing because I know from the episode Red Handed did on this case that his work is just full of misogyny. But when you search on quotestats.com, this is what comes up. Quote, I think because we're such a trading nation, I think Canadians understand that first and foremost, we're part of the global economy. End quote. Stephen Harper.
Okay, but consider this. Have you ever seen Jack Unterweger and Stephen Harper in the same room?
No, I have not.
Just putting it out there. Our listeners are smart enough to figure out what that means.
I was like, why is this here? Anyway, Jack Unterweger became a cause célèbre of the Austrian literary elite. He was a golden child of rehabilitation. From the New York Times, quote, Unterweger became the darling of Vienna's radical chic set, who discovered in his literature the proof of a reformed man, end quote. So to them, his writings are proof that he has changed, and that things like literature programs in prisons can successfully rehabilitate people. Obviously, this wrongfully attempts to substitute material class with culture. Like, nobody robs a bank because they haven't read Tolstoy.
Yeah, and on that note, it also ignores the sort of imbalanced nature of laws in a capitalist society, insofar as Anatole France says, quote, in its majestic equality, the law forbids rich and poor alike to sleep under bridges, beg in the streets, and steal loaves of bread, end quote. Which means that for a lot of laws in which you violate and you commit crime by violating said laws, whether those laws in and of themselves are just is an entirely different argument altogether.
In 1985, a campaign begins to pardon Jack Unterweger and release him from prison. Many of Austria's artistic and literary elite get behind this pardon. I think a lot of people in retrospect criticize this campaign, but these people did believe that he was changed and that they were showing compassion. And as we'll go on to see, that compassion was misguided. But many, many campaigns to pardon incarcerated people are well-founded.
Yeah, I mean, look at our Amy Beale episode for that. And I think those people had their hearts in the right place. I don't think they should be dismissed for that.
Yeah, so many articles on this case are like, oh, those dumb authors, they put all their compassion toward this guy, and it turns out he was bad. And that is really sad, but I don't think we should be shitting on mercy and compassion and forgiveness.
Yeah, I mean, it's also like a right-wing wet dream. Like, look at those liberal academic hippies being all, lovey-dovey and sweet, and see this guy is like evil. Evil is genetic, evil is in it. And, once someone commits a crime, you have to punish them forever.
Well, he was obviously part of this, telling people like, yeah, I'm reformed. I would never do something like that again.
Yeah.
Unterweger is denied a pardon, but then released after his 15-year minimum sentence in May of 1990. So the judge would not allow him to be pardoned and get out early, but he did earn parole after that 15 years. By this point, Unterweger was a famous figure in Austria, and his autobiography was even taught in public schools, which we didn't have any lessons like that in my public school. We learned about, long division.
Yeah, same here.
He also worked as a journalist and a radio broadcaster reporting on crime, which I don't want to shit on crime reporters, but neither Amr nor I have ever murdered anyone, so we've got that going for us.
Yeah. It's kind of fascinating how surely someone must have seen some red flags pop up, but I guess, at this point, everyone wants to believe that the rehab powers of jail have worked.
Yeah, Unterweger is basically upheld as an example of the rehabilitative power of prison and the arts. But, as I'm sure you've all seen coming, on September 15th, 1990, less than 4 months after Unterweger's release from prison, some passers-by in Prague, Czechoslovakia, now the Czech Republic, found the body of a young woman named Blanka Bakova. According to Wikipedia, Bakova was a sex worker. According to Murderpedia, however, and this is a quote, Bakova was a fun-loving girl and was not a prostitute, end quote. Oh my god, you can be a fun-loving girl and also be a sex worker, Murderpedia.
Yeah, that's very puritanical.
Several weeks later, a sex worker named Brunhilde Masser went missing in Graz. 2 months later, a sex worker named Heidemarie Hammerer also went missing. When found, all 3 women had their tights or bras tied around their necks with a very specific knot, evidence of strangulation. In March of 1991, another sex worker named Elfriede Schrempf disappeared from Graz. Shortly after, 4 women, Sylvia Zagler, Sabine Moitzi, Regina Prem, and Karen Eroglu, also vanished. As their bodies were slowly discovered over the following months, they bore the same signs of strangulation by those specific knots.
Yeah, at no point did the local bobbies question Unterweger. I mean, surely they were aware of his criminal history and the specific way in which he murdered the woman he was caught for. How many victims died because of this sort of police incompetence?
Yeah, also anyone vaguely interested in true crime or anyone who has watched Law and Order SVU could tell you that a bunch of victims of the same profile, so young women who are sex workers or fun-loving girls, I guess, being murdered in this very specific way, being strangled and having their bras or tights tied around their necks with these very specific knots, that shows you there's a serial killer. Like, all the signs are there.
Yeah, and like initially Unterweger was arrested and put in prison for the murder of one woman specifically. So he wasn't a serial killer then, it was just Margaret Schaefer who he killed. But I would imagine if you're in Graz, which I imagine is not a particularly massive city, and these murders start happening, you might at least knock on the door of the local woman killer. I mean, it's not like he changed his identity and disappeared from public life. He did become like a celebrity of sorts.
Right, it's the opposite. He didn't change his identity and disappear. He put himself into the spotlight as the reformed murder man.
Yeah, I mean, if anything else, at least go and like, ask him what he thinks is happening, and maybe find something in his apartment or something. I don't know. Like, if a murder starts happening in an area and there's a local guy who's like known for doing a murder, I'd pop into his house at least just to ask a few questions.
Well, if you think the Austrian police are a bit Mr. Magoo, wait until the next part. Because in 1991, an Austrian magazine hired Unterweger to write about sex work and crime in Los Angeles, which, first of all, worry about yourselves, please, Austria. You have a serial murder of sex workers on the loose, and it turns out you are hiring the murderer to write an article about it, but I digress.
Yeah, it's like, in order to write about sex work and serial killing, Unterweger decided to go undercover as a serial killer.
So, Unterweger travels to LA to meet with the LAPD and even does a ride-along with them, where they pointed out popular sex worker hangouts. While Unterweger was in Los Angeles, 3 sex workers, Shannon Exley, Irene Rodriguez, and Peggy Booth, were murdered by strangulation with their own bras. This clearly happened right under the LAPD's nose.
First of all, can I point out how disturbing it is that he did a ride along with the LAPD and they basically just drove him around popular sex worker hangouts? That's like if wolves drove around the lion pointing out their favorite watering holes for gazelle or whatever. Also, I think the greatest trick crime dramas ever pull is portraying cops and detectives as moderately capable and effective workers and not the bumbling, idiotic oafs that they really are.
Also, not to get all tinfoil hat here, but I honestly wouldn't be surprised if the LAPD shared some laughs with this fucking murderer about their mutual hatred of women and sex workers. Jack Unterweger killed not 1, not 2, but 3 women in his short time in Los Angeles, a city where he was a tourist. Surely somebody had to have sniffed that something was up.
Okay, let's do some math here. Assuming the cops were driving a regular car at full capacity with 1 driver, 1 front passenger, and 2 backseat passengers, of which 1 is a cop and 1 is Unterweger, statistically, 1.2 of the cops in that car beat their spouses, or 40%. And in other words, I'm sure they had a few laughs regarding the violence towards women.
Also, he is a tourist, and one thing that serial murders often get caught doing is disposing of bodies in a wrong way or something like that. It's much harder to commit a murder in a place you don't know that well.
Yeah.
The fact that he was able to do 3 murders, he killed 3 women in Los Angeles when the LAPD knew that he was there writing a case about the murders of sex workers. Oh my God.
Also, like, okay, a bunch of women start disappearing and being killed in Austria, in Graz, okay? And then Unterweger flies off to LA, and when he flies off, the murders and disappearances in Graz stop. And in the same time, 3 women are disappeared and killed in LA. Like, it's not that hard. It's fucking obvious.
We say it all the time on this podcast that truth is stranger than fiction. If you wrote this into an episode of Law & Order SVU, I'd be like, fucking stop. This is annoying.
Yeah, it would be way too on the nose.
So, finally, The Austrian federal police realized that they might have a serial murderer on their hands, as they had half a dozen bodies in a year with the same MO. And one detective in particular, Dr. Ernst Geiger, was convinced that Jack Unterweger was not the reformed man he said he was. So the police began tracking Unterweger's movements through credit card receipts and rental cars. And sure enough, all his travels lined up with the murders. DNA tests on a hair fragment found in a BMW Unterweger rented were a match to Blanka Bakova, the victim in Prague. Meanwhile, Unterweger suspects that the police might be onto him, and he begins writing disparaging articles about how bad the police are at tracking down this serial killer, who is definitely not him, by the way. A warrant is issued for Unterweger's arrest in connection with the murders, but he and his teenage girlfriend flee to Miami, and keep in mind he's like 40 at this point, by the way. What a fucking idiot. You go somewhere without an extradition treaty. You do not go to Miami, you fucking moron.
Also, just like, I don't know, lay low for a bit, change your identity. This was in the 90s, so I imagine it's not that hard to change your identity. Again, he seems to be doing what Alan Dershowitz is doing right now, which is constantly pushing himself into the public eye to defend himself at all times. Which then again, I mean, is working for Dersh, so I guess, go big or go home.
Yeah, Unterweger called Austrian radio stations from Miami, saying that the police were scapegoating him for all of these murders. But meanwhile, Unterweger was writing plans in his journal on how he planned to kill his girlfriend and dispose of her body. Like, literally, he does everything wrong by Das Kriminal standards.
Or everything right if you want more Das Kriminal episodes.
Unterweger is caught by police when he goes to collect money wired from his girlfriend's mother, which is the exact way that Dr. Slepian's killer was caught a couple episodes ago. Like, these people all make the same mistakes. Initially, Unterweger wanted to be charged for the 3 murders in California rather than 1 in Prague and 7 in Austria, but then he realized California still had the death penalty and he chose to be extradited to Austria for trial. Unterweger tried to charm the jury, saying that as a successful writer with a much younger girlfriend, why would he need to commit sex crimes? Which is just so gag. He was found guilty of 9 counts of murder, and it was certain that this time he was going away for the rest of his life. On the night of June 29th, 1994, Jack Unterweger strangled himself with his shoelaces and a cord from his track pants. He used the same knot he had used to murder his victims. Because Unterweger's sentence had not yet been confirmed by the court, he technically died as not yet guilty under Austrian law. So at first, this might seem like a case against rehabilitation, but keep in mind, Unterweger went to prison and he was not rehabilitated. So prison did not work at rehabilitating Unterweger. Moreover, prison also plays some other nefarious roles in this story, like imprisoning Unterweger's mother and thereby separating her from her child and obviously having a part in Unterweger's hatred of women, and also in criminalizing sex workers. But of course, there's a bigger question looming over all of this. Without prisons, what should we as a society do about people like Jack Unterweger? He was obviously a danger to other people, to sex workers in particular, so it's not like he can just be in society without any supervision. He was a pathological serial murderer. We obviously need to address all the conditions that make the Jack Unterwegers, like childhood poverty, addiction, a culture of misogyny and hatred of sex workers. But what is to be done in the meantime? And what should we do if this doesn't work? For example, the USSR still had serial killers like Andrei Chikatilo. China has had serial killers like Yang Shanhai. It's not like revolution puts an end to sexually motivated crimes.
Yeah, I actually find it disturbing how many leftists and abolitionists hand-wave away any concerns about pathological serial killers or serial rapists. I mean, on the one hand, yeah, such concerns coming from the right are usually done in bad faith and sometimes are vehicles for dog whistling. Sure, like when you hear a right winger say about certain immigrants being rapists or whatever, that's not exactly, he's not coming from a place of abolition. But on the other hand, crimes of violence will continue. I mean, I personally think that some people are just, they just have bad wiring, right? And like you can argue that with Jack Unterweger, there were a lot of social conditions that led to his pathologies. But then you will have people with just bad wiring, a lack of empathy. And I don't want to get in the weeds too much on the nature versus nurture debate and the neuroscience behind that, for example. But clearly, some non zero portion of the population are pathologically dangerous to others. And what is to be done with them?
I think another poignant example, which we've been meaning to tackle on this podcast and probably will at some point, is the case of Elliot Rodger. He had every opportunity. He came from a massively wealthy family and he still hated women and he still killed women.
Not all serial killers come from like broken households or whatever. Like he seemed to have come from a fairly well-off, fairly materially comfortable background, and he still, was pathologically murderous and violent. And you can't just put Elliot Rodger in a healing circle and he'll rehabilitate. It's not as easy as that.
And you can't just, quote unquote, exile him from your community. Because first of all, what community is he in? The incel community or like the state of California? And what does that mean? He just goes somewhere else and becomes someone else's problem?
Yeah. Anarchists always talk about that. And I'm sitting there and I'm like, so you're basically just dumping your problem on some other town across the border or whatever.
I mean, that did work back in the day. You could just like exile annoying people. It was definitely a thing.
No. But back in the day, you exiled people because you thought they were a witch or because, they smelled funny or they had one too many boils on their face or whatever, not because of, serial murdering.
Even the staunchest prison abolitionists will agree that people who repeatedly harm others, especially this way, and cannot stop themselves, are not safe to be out in society. But I also think, and this is a bigger conversation, we need to reshape the conversation around crime in general. I think it's wrong to equate crimes of poverty, like self-destructive addiction, theft, etc., to things like sex crimes, which serve no quote-unquote purpose other than harming people for the gratification of the perpetrator. These things are very different in my mind. And prison abolition thus requires revolutionary thought about crime as well as about punishment. A crucial distinction between crimes which violate capitalist norms by breaching property laws and those which harm another person is really necessary to this discussion.
Yeah, and I just wanted to tack on to keep in mind the disproportionate incidences of sexual violence in prisons as well, and how society normalizes and even mocks victims of such violence. I mean, it's clear that serial rapists would need to be removed from society in some form. I also think there needs to be further interrogation on how our current carceral system imprisons such violent offenders and perpetrators of property and poverty crimes in the same setting, and thus facilitating in-prison violence. And then that itself is dismissed as, what you said earlier, non-human crime, non-person crime. The people who are guilty of property crimes are seen as deserving of such violence.
I think we have to talk about what justice and reparation for this kind of harm will look like in a post-carceral society. I think these conversations, while uncomfortable, are very necessary to have. What would we do with people like Jack Unterweger without prison? And I have seen some people say, we'd shoot them, we'd kill them. And I understand that impulse, but I have seen cases. There was a case in my hometown of Buffalo, New York, where a man served many years in prison for a series of rapes that he did not commit. And he had a mental illness, he could not properly defend himself, and later was proven by DNA evidence to be innocent. Thank God that man was not executed.
Yeah, these things are much harder than they look, and I think we can have a long discussion about that. But we can leave it to you, our listeners. Let us know what you think about this. And you can reach us on our Patreon at patreon.com/duscriminal or Instagram at duscriminalpod. Do follow, do leave reviews, do let us know what you think. And I'm sure the bonus episode will be out now as well.
Thank you guys so much for listening. We hope that we have given you some food for thought. That's really what we aim to do. We, of course, talk about our opinions, but we want to hear yours as well. What kinds of things interest you?
Yeah, we practice mass line theory as Maoists. So let us know what you think. And until next time, everyone.
For our Patreon subscribers, $5 and up subscribers, we will be at you sometime this week talking about current events, politics. For the rest of you, see you on Tuesday.
Bye.
Bye.